We're going on assignment with the Voice of America.
Hello and welcome to a special edition of On Assignment as we look back on the life of former South African president and anti-apartheid icon Nelson Mandela.
The man known affectionately as Madiba or Tata died on December 5th at the age of 95. We'll talk with VOA program hosts and reporters about Mandela's groundbreaking political legacy.
We will also be talking about Mr. Mandela's impact on the young, his place in South Africa's sports history, and more.
Our special episode on the life of Nelson Mandela starts right now.
My very first political action, the first thing I ever did that involved an issue or a policy or politics, was a protest against apartheid. Let us pause and give thanks for the fact that Nelson Mandela lived, a man who took history in his hands.
Nelson Mandela leaves behind a vast political and human rights legacy. He is admired in South Africa and around the world for leading the intense struggle to end South Africa's oppressive system of racial segregation known as apartheid. He spent 27 years in prison for his opposition to white minority rule, and he emerged to become South Africa's first black president in 1994. Now, I am joined by Dimyake Mwakalyelye, lead reporter. Hello, Dimyake. Welcome to the show. She is the lead reporter and anchor at large for Africa 54, VOA's daily English TV program to Africa. Now, Dimi, you are living here in the U.S., reporting from here.
Yes.
But you are from Tanzania yourself.
Yes.
Grew up in Zimbabwe, and so, of course, issues regarding the African continent are still very close for you.
Very close.
How have you responded to this outpouring of support that we've seen from figures around the world at Nelson Mandela's passing?
I have to say I knew it was going to be an outpouring of support, but I have to say I'm astounded by the extent of it. You know, when you think right now as we speak, 4 U.S. presidents in South Africa, in addition to about 100, I believe, top officials from different countries around the world. And just never mind the common people. This man just seemed to have had such an impact on such a personal level to so many people. And I think more and more as people are beginning to hear about him, they are starting to feel and understand why he has this persona that attracts presidents and queens and leaders from all over the world. So the surprise is just that it's much more than I expected, but I was always sure that it was going to be a big moment, and I think a lot of people knew that too.
Speaking of that personal impact that he's had for you, being African yourself, how would you describe his impact on your own life, and then also among people who are not just South African, but just Africans as a whole?
Well, the saddest thing is I never got to meet him, which I know is true for a lot of people around the world, but I feel like I know him. And that is what I find that so many people are saying. I've met so many South Africans, many who have not met him directly or, you know, touched him, but somehow that impact, you know. And the same is true, growing up in Zimbabwe, being in Tanzania. Of course, my first real strong knowledge of apartheid was through some of the South Africans who were living in Zimbabwe at the time, who were escaping the apartheid regime, and they just spoke so highly of this man. And when I started understanding myself, I felt like, you know, he was somebody to be revered, somebody to be admired, and personally, you know, like President Obama said, makes him a better man, makes me a better woman, for sure, yeah.
You talk about feeling like you knew him. How did you react when you found out that he had passed?
Well, I was here at work, and I just heard it down the hallway, Mandela's dead, or Mandela died. And I was on the phone, and I just found myself almost about to break down and cry. And I don't know why, it just hit me so personally, you know. Of course, everybody knew it was going to happen. He has been sick for a while, and it was one of those things that, you know, for me, I guess it was a sense of oh my gosh, the world has lost something, you know, like glue. He was like this glue that I felt, for one, even as he was in the background, really kept South Africa together. And even as he was in the background, really kept the world together, because every time somebody referred to Mandela, it was almost like, you know, just this sense of righteousness. So it hit me in a way that surprised me, actually. But again, like I said, the more I keep hearing about him, I understand why.
What is it about Mandela and his story that you think contributes to him being such a powerful symbol for people like us all over the world?
As I keep hearing it, and as I keep, you know, directly hearing from people who have met him about how he walked into a room and apparently you just felt that a powerful man walked in, even though he himself was so humble. That is it, his humility, his sense of compassion, his sense of forgiveness, the need to forgive, the need to reconcile. After 27 years, of which he served under a very brutal, you know, prison system, where he was made to do a lot of hard labor. He was even forbidden from going to bury his children who had died while he was there. And just at the end of the day, being able to still, once he was out, invite them to his inauguration, and more importantly, make them feel that they were welcome and not that they were there to be taunted and made to feel like, you know, I'm going to show the world. So it was a very interesting, it was interesting how he gave it, and it was interesting how people received it. There was that sense of genuineness.
Absolutely. Yeah. An unbelievable life and legacy that Mandela has left us with now. Thank you so much, Dimi. We really appreciate you coming on. Again, Dimiake Mwakalyelege, reporter and anchor for VOA's Africa 54 program. Thank you so much for stopping by.
Thanks for inviting me.
All right, well, Nelson Mandela is the figurative father of South Africa, but he is the literal father of 6 children, and he had 17 grandchildren, including Kwaku Mandela, who was born when his grandfather was still in prison. Kwaku Mandela was in Washington earlier this year, and he stopped by VOA to talk about his famous grandfather. VOA's Carolyn Pursuti has the story.
Kwaku Mandela didn't know his grandfather's history when he first met him at age 4. He didn't know about his struggle against apartheid and his leadership of the African National Congress that led to 27 years in prison. Kwaku visited his grandfather here during his final year of arrest at what was then known as Victor Verster Prison. It was the only time the government allowed family inside Mr. Mandela's rooms.
They had cartoons on the TV, and he immediately walked in and, you know, said, is this my grandson? And offered us hot chocolate.
Kwaku says his grandfather immediately charmed his grandchildren. And when he got out of prison, those young relatives became his teachers.
There was such a gulf. When he went to prison, there was no such thing as mobile telephones or color TVs or TVs at all. So he came out and he had to learn these things pretty quickly.
Kwaku says his grandfather's legacy is here in Kwunu, South Africa. It's where Mr. Mandela grew up, tending cattle in this small village. He also retired in Kwunu. Kwaku says Nelson Mandela's life demonstrates the potential we all have.
One thing that's always fascinated me about my granddad's story is how a rural country boy transforms himself to become the first democratically elected president and black president of South Africa. And that kind of shows me that any individual, regardless of their background or where they come from, can have a major impact on the community they live in and in the world at large.
Kwaku Mandela is completing a documentary on his grandfather. It's expected to be released by the end of the year. Carolyn Pursuti, VOA News, Washington.
And coming up next in our special episode, my co-host Imran talks with VOA's Jackson Vunganyi about Nelson Mandela's impact on the youth. You're watching On Assignment.
Some 60,000 South Africans gathered on December 10th to bid farewell to anti-apartheid icon Nelson Mandela. The event in the rain at a Johannesburg soccer stadium brought together dignitaries and celebrities from around the world, as well as ordinary South Africans who braved long waits and bad weather to pay tribute to the man everyone calls Madiba. Mr. Mandela's impact on Africa will be felt for a long time, perhaps most notably by young people. And I'm joined today by Jackson Ungavi, co-host of Upfront, a fast-paced radio variety show for young Africans. Thank you so much for joining me.
You're welcome. Thank
you.
you.
What do you think Nelson Mandela meant for the young people of Africa?
Well, Nelson Mandela represented a spirit of resilience for many young Africans, not just South Africans. And he continues to be that symbol of a person who persevered under insurmountable circumstances. You remember he had to face a regime that was not holding back in terms of its power, in its ability to crush the anti-apartheid activists like Nelson Mandela. So young people in these very challenging times right now on the continent, all over the continent, look at Mandela as a source of inspiration in many ways.
In your program, Upfront, you and your co-host, what kind of reactions are you guys getting?
Well, there's a sadness, really, that he has passed, but we saw this coming. But also, if you look at some of the imagery and some of the people that we've spoken to on the show, there's a celebration. Celebration that we were alive, really, frankly, as we lived, inhabited the planet at the same time as a very great individual. There are very few Mandelas that will live during our lifetime, and he's one in a million. And so they're very happy that they were around, they were able to see what he did. And they're also happy that some of the achievements that he fought for, they're enjoying some of those achievements right now. It's a much more, there's less, even though there's high unemployment, but you can see that there's an opportunity for them, for social migration in terms of, getting jobs, having education, having some money in their pockets and things of that nature, things that Nelson Mandela fought for.
Considering that he's gone through a lot in his life, what kind of role model do you think he can be for not just leaders in Africa, but around the world?
Well, Nelson Mandela is, a leader that wants to be emulated. And I say wants to be emulated because there's so many leaders across the African continent who want to attach their name to him and his accomplishments. But since, honestly, there are very few that can stand up to him. He set a standard, a bar that's really high for anybody, any of the leaders we have in power right now to attain, to achieve, and they can try to aspire to get there. But it does not mean that the young people who are the future leaders of the continent cannot aspire to be the Nelson Mandelas of tomorrow.
I've always wanted to meet the guy. I couldn't. What about you? Did you get a chance to meet him?
I never got a chance to meet him. I would have loved to meet, Madiba, but I feel like many other people that we kind of, met him somehow. He was part of our lives in many ways, whether through pop culture, whether through his struggles, through, TV, through movies, the songs, the music. On the show today, we played music that had that was about Nelson Mandela. So you could fill a whole album, pop culture album with Nelson Mandela. That's how much this man was revered.
And in closing, if you can just tell us, what was that one thing about him that attracted people towards him? I mean, there was something on his face that he had this charismatic look.
Very charismatic fella.
What was the core of Nelson Mandela?
I think that he had a persona around him, a coolness. He's a man who has endured a lot of suffering, but he was still always had a smile on his face. He was a man who was very forgiving. When we watched the memorial ceremony, some of the people that were part of the process of putting him in so much trouble that he went were part of the memorial process. Procession, and that speaks to the character of a man who is very willing to forgive and look past everything that has been done to him because he understood the struggle in its larger context, that the struggle was much bigger than Mandela. He had a very fatherly quality to him too, that's why they called him Tata or Madiba, or others called him Madiba, teacher. But Mandela will always be remembered. He's one in a lifetime type of figure that, and we're so happy to have lived in the same time with him.
And on that note, Jackson, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
Jackson Mungani, host of a very popular Upfront program on VOA.
Thank you.
We're taking another break. Coming up, Nelson Mandela's impact was felt just as strongly in South Africa's sports world. Sonny Young joins Alex for that in a moment. You're watching On Assignment.
Nelson Mandela was a fighter in every sense of the word. He was an amateur boxer as a young man, and he credited the sport with helping instill discipline and the will to persevere through adversity. I am joined now by VOA's Sunny Young from the sunny side of sports. Hi, Sunny. Welcome.
Hi, Alex.
Well, we're going to talk about Mr. Mandela's lifelong association with sports, and that's really what it was, wasn't it, Sunny? I mean, he was a student of boxing, but he really had a love for all kinds of sports.
He was a big sports fan, Alex. As you mentioned, he was an amateur boxer in his younger days. He was also a runner. In his autobiography, Long Walk to Freedom, he wrote about how much boxing helped him withstand the blows of hatred and imprisonment, 27 years behind bars. When he came out, he looked very fit. He was in his early 70s when he got released from prison.
Wow.
But I think his love of fitness really helped him live a long life.
That's an interesting aspect of his legacy, too, because I think a lot of us hear about Mandela in association with politics and apartheid, but to know that he was such a sports figure as well.
He also is credited with helping South Africa win its first African Cup of Nations title. That's kind of like the African Championship in Africa football. They won it a few years after he was released from prison, and he inspired the team just like he inspired the rugby team in 1995.
Right, which I wanted to talk about. So there's this film, of course, about that championship, the Rugby World Championship in 1995. And the film stars Matt Damon. It's called Invictus. And that event is very emblematic, of course, as you mentioned, to Nelson Mandela's power to lead and unite his people. So what more can you tell us about that?
Well, Matt Damon portrayed the captain of that 1995 Rugby World Championship team, Stephen Pienaar, who, by the way, was at Soccer City Stadium for Mr. Mandela's official public memorial. Pienaar, he describes it like he developed a very unique relationship with Mandela. They decided that this rugby team could be used to reconcile the South African people. The rugby team was very much viewed with disdain by the blacks in South Africa. They saw it as a legacy of apartheid. And Mr. Mandela threw his support behind the team. The Springboks is the nickname of the team. And in one of the most emotional scenes from that movie you mentioned, Mr. Mandela presents the trophy to Stephen Pienaar at Ellis Park in Johannesburg, and the crowd just went crazy in appreciation. He's very much viewed as a man who reconciled the South African people out of a very difficult period in that country's history.
And then how amazing, too, that his memorial was held in this sports stadium.
Soccer City Stadium, also called the FNB Stadium in Johannesburg, where, coincidentally, he made what is really regarded as his last public appearance before the 2010 World Cup final between Spain and the Netherlands. I was at the stadium that night, Alex, and I remember every fan getting out of their seats to cheer Mr. Mandela. He came into the stadium in a golf cart, and they just loved to see him. He didn't stay long because it was a very chilly night in Johannesburg, but yeah, I think it may be appropriate that he kind of said farewell at Soccer City.
What was that like for you, that moment, seeing Mr. Mandela in person, such an icon and someone you've, of course, studied in history books and you've reported on?
Well, I was kind of up in the nosebleed section, so I wasn't exactly within arm's reach of Mr. Mandela, but it was still a thrilling moment to be there in front of such a huge crowd and to see, you know, one of the greatest men of this century.
Right. Now, finally, very, very quickly, that 2010 World Cup, he's credited with bringing the World Cup to South Africa. What is the significance of that?
A lot of people feel if it wasn't for Mr. Mandela's lobbying on behalf of South Africa, that the first World Cup ever staged in Africa would not have been. It would have gone to perhaps Morocco, which was another bidding country for that World Cup. But yeah, he's very much seen as the man instrumental in bringing the World Cup to South Africa.
Right, huge impact on the world of sports. Thank you so much, Sunny. We really appreciate you coming on today. Again, this is Sunny Young of VOA's Sunny Side of Sports.
Thank you, Alex.
All right, thank you, Sunny. Now, after his release from prison and rapid rise to the presidency in 1994, Nelson Mandela also became an unlikely fashion icon in South Africa. VOA's Anita Powell takes a look at this much different aspect of Mr. Mandela's legacy.
Nelson Mandela's friends say he always had an impeccable sense of how to make a statement. After his release from prison, he made fashion news with his gaily patterned silk shirts. They're now called Madiba shirts, a reference to his clan name. But he also wore the traditional garb of his Xhosa people at times during his struggle, as a symbol of defiance to the white-led government. He later said he was literally carrying on my back the history, culture, and heritage of my people. That's the mission of a fashion line started in his honor. It's called 46664, after his prisoner number at Robben Island, and it aims to further his legacy and his sartorial style, while funding charitable projects along the way, such as schools and libraries. Wayne Babb, CEO of the brand, says the line strives to spread Mr. Mandela's spirit, but not replicate his distinctive wardrobe.
Mr. Mandela was a unique dresser. He had his own expressive style. But I think the message in that was not necessarily about fashion, but that message was that you can express yourself in any which way and you should feel comfortable about doing that. So our brand takes that iconic inspiration of the man and his messaging and his wording, and it translates that in every touch point of the brand.
Young designers in Johannesburg say the country's first black president has inspired them to embrace their culture in their designs. Sandy Mabasa employs a staff of local tailors to create her urban yet ethnic look for her fashion line, Fabricans. She says she often hears one request from customers.
They're asking, Sandy, can you do us Madiba shirts? So I think he has, in a way, has influenced the fashion.
Vusi Klumalo, the co-owner of the House of Grand Aristocrats, says these brightly colored shirts are a fresh, young interpretation of the Madiba shirt.
He has in some way influenced us in terms of fashion and where we come from the dark days into where we are right now.
South Africa's fashion scene is evolving, but cherishes its traditional influences. Today's young designers are taking that forward in new and colorful ways, and they all say they owe that freedom to one well-dressed, brave man, Nelson Mandela. Anita Powell, VOA News, Johannesburg.
And with that, we conclude this special edition of On Assignment dedicated to Tata, modern South Africa's revered father.
And we want to thank all our VOA colleagues who took the time to share their reflections with us.
We'll be back next week with another news show when our reporters will talk about the resurgence of polio in the Middle East and the growing worldwide phenomenon of massive wildfires.
You can catch all of our programs at voanews.com. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll catch you next week.
I have fought very firmly against black domination. I cherish the ideal of a new South Africa where all South Africans are equal.
He also made us understand that we can change the world.
Never again shall it be that this beautiful land will again experience the oppression of one by another and suffer the indignity.
Happy birthday to you.
Now we must develop determination or enthusiasm to carry his spirit.
A moral giant who embodied the dignity and the courage and the hope and sought to bring about justice not only in South Africa, but I think to inspire millions around the world.